What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a DLC review for Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader's Lex Imperialis DLC. So, a lot to cover with this one. First and foremost, I'm bringing you this video, I believe, right as the DLC is going live, if not, maybe a little bit before it, but, same day, at the very least. And the reason for that is, of course, that Owlcat Games gave me early access to this DLC, so I could, of course, bring you this review. Now, that does actually come with another caveat, though, as well. This time around, they didn't have the achievements and everything ready, and they were still actively working on the DLC when they provided me access to it a couple weeks ago. To that end, some things in the DLC were not completely finished. Things like final art for a couple of the characters. Some of the cutscenes that are supposed to be in the DLC aren't completely finished in this build as well, but presumably you will experience when you actually play the game. And on top of that, they provided some save files so you could see the content across the entire game. Because if you are unaware, this DLC, just like Void Shadows, is integrated into the game's main campaign, which is itself fairly long. And this adds roughly another 10 to 15 hours worth of content across that experience in the various chapters of the game. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. Essentially, what this DLC ultimately brings us is the Arbitrator background or origin, the Overseer archetype, which is a second-tier archetype, which allows you to use things like familiars, etc., and then, of course, the actual story of the DLC itself. Now, what I do not have information on, basically, is the patch that typically drops beside these updates. So I'm not really going to talk much about that. I really don't know if there will be anything substantial in there as an example, as I was mostly focused on just the content for this. And so, with that stuff out of the way, let's actually dive into it and talk about it. Now, outside of the content and story that you'll be able to experience for yourself, you also have some significant gameplay changes in the form of the Arbitrator Origin as well as the Overseer class. So the Arbitrator Origin effectively allows you to have previously been a member of the Adeptus Arbites before you were brought aboard to be a successor to the Von Valancius dynasty. Arbitrators, like all of your other origins, give you specific options in terms of actual ways to build a character as well as unique things that relate to that character, like in terms of background and how you can talk about your past experiences as an example. So this is fully integrated into the entire game, but a lot of what an arbitrator is good at is utilizing shotguns, shields, and destroying defenses on enemies, that kind of thing. They have some really interesting talents that they can make use of, some of which even focus on attacks of opportunity, like their lawful intervention talent that will allow them to parry with their ranged weapon for starters, but also allowing them to use their ranged weapon as a melee attack of opportunity. Now, you don't get all of these by default, to be clear. If you haven't played the game before or anything like that, these are options you can take as you level up. But that's not all. There are actually sort of three sub-origins, I guess you could call them, via the Vigilant, Castigator, and Subductor types. Basically, each of these is good at a different type of combat. The Vigilant is really into, utilizing shotguns. Castigator is great if you want to take the Officer class as an example because it focuses on fellowship and willpower, which is a good lead-in to the Overseer class as well, which takes the Familiar as an example. And then the Subductor is great with melee weapons and shields as an example. So this background has a lot going on for it. And that's before you start taking your class or your archetype. And then probably unsurprisingly though, given the addition of things like shields and the expansion of already present weapon types like shotguns, you can make a lot of really good use of that. There are new shotguns that drop as part of the DLC as an example that are really, really good. The shields I have actually enjoyed quite a bit. We'll talk about those in a moment. But as a background, both in terms of the lore as well as what it does mechanically, it's a really good time. But for those who just don't know what an arbitrator is, probably worth a mention that this effectively marks you as a previous member of the Adeptus Arbites, which are a law enforcement force, so to speak, that uphold the Lex Imperialis, and a significant portion of what they do is basically ensure the delivery of the Imperial Tithe. An easy way to think of them is like Judge Dredd. Moving on a little bit though, because then we have the Overseer archetype. This is a second-tier archetype, which means you pick your initial starting class, and then at level 16, when you've maxed out your base class, if it has the option of taking the Overseer archetype, then you can take it then. Each introductory class has several different options it can choose from the second tier options. The Overseer is a second tier option. Now, what does make this slightly unique is that if you are an Arbitrator, you should be able to take the Overseer archetype no matter what. Typically speaking, the Officer and the Operative archetypes, the starting archetypes, will be able to take the Overseer one under normal circumstances, but Sanctioned Psychers and Arbitrators, as an example, can also just take this regardless of what their starting class is, which gives them a little more flexibility to choose this, which is an interesting thing to note. Now, the big thing about the Overseer is basically that they get a companion that they can order around the battlefield on top of a bunch of other abilities that typically direct that companion in some way. Now, what's really interesting about this is that each of these familiars or companions augments a certain play style. For example, we can get a Cyber Mastiff, a Cyber Raven, a Servo Skull Swarm, or a Cyber Eagle. If you want to take an Overseer as a Sanctioned Psyker, for example, you can pick up the Cyber Raven, which will give you a conduit through which to channel your Psyker abilities, as an example. It can also deal some warp damage and things like that for you, in addition to what you can do every turn. The Cyber Mastiff is great for actually running up and engaging on enemies. Now, it's probably worth a mention that these familiars don't get a separate turn of their own in combat. They get abilities that you can utilize on your turn to use them in combat. A lot of them don't cost like action points or anything, and you can activate them basically once per turn. Some of them do cost action points, so you do have to play around with the resources a little bit there. Because of how a lot of this works, I wouldn't consider the Overseer like a direct damage focused archetype. It's more about battlefield control and support, and while it can certainly deal pretty good damage if they lean into it fully, it is not as like wildly overpowered as the Blade Dancer Executioner with a Sanctioned Psyker background that we saw in Void Shadows. It's a little more reined in because the focus isn't entirely on just dealing massive amounts of damage. But having played around with them in this DLC, of course, still very fun. Another cool thing is that each individual familiar does actually have its own heroic moment that will heal and charge up the familiar itself, alongside providing a unique benefit based on, what familiar it actually is. So for instance, the Cyber Raven allows you to use the Raven as a conduit for your attack powers, basically giving you extra range. Whereas the Cyber Mastiff will deal an additional bit of damage based on the familiar's weapon skill as a percentage of the target's max health, while reducing their own max health, though. So some interesting ways to play around with things there mechanically. But from there, let's move on to the bigger part of the DLC, the content itself, which includes a new companion, a member of the Adeptus Arbites as well. As has already been previously announced, all of this content essentially revolves around the collection of the Imperial Tithe as it relates to our Rogue Trader dynasty and the various worlds under our control. So, for those who don't know, the Imperial Tithe is basically the tribute that every planet owes to the Imperium of Man, which is what funds and fuels their war efforts. To put it very simply, for the most part, each planet is left to their own devices to rule how they please, so long as the Imperial Tithe has been paid, alongside the core tenets of the Lex Imperialis being followed. And the payment of the Imperial Tithe is ultimately what the Adeptus Arbites concern themselves with. Now, you'll start to see this new content right away in Act 1, but your new companion will not join you until Act 2. I would assume this is because Solomourne Anthar, our new companion, is actually an Overseer archetype. His familiar actually is directly written into his character, Glato, which I thought was a bit of a strange name for a companion, but if you ask him about it, he explains that's because the serial number for the Mastiff is GL80. So he calls him Glato. Because of this, he has to take the Overseer archetype as an example, which means if you were to meet him in Act 1, he actually wouldn't meet the level requirements, or he would be too high of a level for that to make sense. As a result of this, you will meet him in Act 1 as part of the stories there, and what he is doing is tracking down a shipment of the Imperial Tithe that has gone missing, of course. Later on, in Act 2, he will meet up with you again, basically asking you to help him track down the ship that has then since been found, and you obviously take that fight to the pirates who have stolen it, and it is through these interactions and then meeting with a delegation of the Adeptus Arbites, or like the branch of them that has been working with the Von Valancius dynasty to collect their tithes for the past several generations, that ultimately puts Solomourne into your party. And at that point, much of the DLC content is simultaneously Solomourne's character quests or companion quests are ultimately going to see you going around to worlds and seeing what is going on with the Imperial tithe there and how this connects back to the Administratum back on your own home planet of Dargonis. This takes place also in Chapter 2 and then in Chapter 4 as well. Chapter 3, just like all of the other full-fledged companions, if you bring Solomourne along with you, will have unique dialogue and things to find out and say to you, that kind of thing, before his companion arc ultimately wraps up in Chapter 4. Now, while I will just be upfront in the fact that I think this particular DLC content does not quite live up to what Void Shadows has to offer, I do think it's really cool at the same time. For starters, the first main bit of content that we'll actually be able to go around and explore a little bit and interact with outside of the initial assault on the ship sees you going to a feudal world where the people living there are kind of, in the feudal era more or less, just with a different level of technology. Actually winds up having a really cool quest associated with it that I'm not going to spoil, obviously. And then once the tithe there has been sorted out and recovered, you can report that back to the Administratum before ultimately being sort of requisitioned to solve more problems in Chapter 4. But what gets really interesting is when Chapter 4 rolls around, I just wanted to point out that I personally did not quite connect the dots. I was of the mind that I was clearly missing something. Like something was going to happen here that I just wasn't following along with, because all of this is supposed to be closely connected to the Von Valancius dynasty. And it is. In fact, you're going to get some history of the Von Valancius dynasty and some plots surrounding it, based purely on the collection of the Imperial tithe and how it relates back to the rogue trader's own wealth, as an example. So even all the way in Chapter 4, I was just, again, a little confused about how it was all going to come together, but towards the end it actually does, and I thought it was a really interesting ending. Again, I don't think it quite hits the highs of Void Shadows, but I did enjoy it, and there are definitely some twists and things. Again, one I did not see coming at all, but having, played through it at this point, there are definitely hints about what is about to happen. In fact, there was one very specific moment when I kind of suddenly connected a few of the dots on what had seemed like random fights in the meantime, which makes sense as, the Adeptus Arbites are supposed to be like law enforcement and investigators to some degree. So if you look at it through that lens, there is actually a sort of investigation element to the overall story arc of the DLC you might actually see coming before it happens, which I thought was really fun. Now, moving on from that a little bit, I want to wrap up this video by talking about a few of the interesting additions that I just thought were worth talking about, which was mainly shields, which are a completely new item, and then just a few novelties here and there. So I mentioned we captured that captain's ship who stole part of the tithe from Rykad Minoris. Well, you can actually, if you want to, repair that ship and start to use it in space battles, which is in addition to the other escort ship you can get through colony management, which means you get, if you want to, again, an entire extra ship to conduct space battles with, which I thought was really cool. And in typical Rogue Trader fashion, you can also just sell the thing if you want as well. So that was kind of neat. From that same battle, you'll also get a bit of unique ship equipment, which gives you the Drakari shielding that you see them use in space battles, which wasn't available to us previously. So even in the space battle side of things, there is some additions in this DLC. The really big item improvements, though, come in shotguns and shields. There's a lot of other new items and things to experience as well, but I would say these two are the main one given the nature of the DLC. So let's talk shields. These are interesting because they take up both of your offhand slots in your weapon sets, meaning that of the two weapon sets you can typically swap between, a shield takes up that second slot in both weapon sets, meaning that you can't use a one-hand and shield and then swap to a different weapon set as the sort of mood strikes you. You're going to have to use that shield in both weapon sets. But unsurprisingly, these basically just give you a % chance to block incoming attacks where it would make sense to block. Psychic attacks from things like Psychers and the like obviously cannot be blocked, as that wouldn't really make any sense. Otherwise, it's just that % chance of blocking them in addition to your normal mitigation. A lot of them tend to convey, of course, defensive stats as well, such as extra deflection to just flat reduce damage you do take. So even there, they're particularly useful. And then of course, a lot of them also have extra effects, which can be interesting to play around with based on the shields you find throughout the DLC for the most part, probably unsurprisingly. And then shotguns kind of go hand in hand with that. And also unsurprisingly, arbitrators get a lot of talents as part of their class kit in order to make effective use of both of these things. In fact, if you want to use a shotgun, I would say Arbitrator is almost certainly the way to go in terms of a background there, because things that allow them to use, say, a two-handed one via just one hand, which also lets them utilize things like a shield as an example. So that in combination with extra abilities that they get just for having a shotgun, and then you could pick up the soldier starting archetype to give you even more abilities that lean into firearms. Anyway, you could make a really strong build around these now, which is interesting because personally, I never really liked using the shotguns specifically before this, outside of like the first opening act. Whereas now I could definitely see myself building an entire build around it. In addition to that, there's also just more interesting shotguns as part of the DLC. You'll find a bunch that have different effects, better damage ranges, all of the typical things you would expect. So, bringing all of that together to a cohesive conclusion, I don't actually have the exact pricing information for this DLC, but considering that it's part of Season Pass 1, and Void Shadows was also part of that, and itself had a similar level of content brought to you for $18 US, I would assume that Lex Imperialis is likely going to be the same price. And if that's the case, I think $18 for this is very reasonable. You get a completely new origin, a new archetype, which completely changes how you can play the game, which can affect not only new characters, but old builds as well, who can then adapt that Overseer archetype, even if they don't use the Arbitrator Origin. Solomourne, as well as the storyline around the Adeptus Arbites and how it connects back to the Von Valancius dynasty, I thought was really cool. And while, again, I will be upfront, I do not think this DLC hits the highs of Void Shadows, I do also think it's a really good DLC, especially when you factor in how much it actually costs. This is a lot of content, a lot of new ways to play this game for a reasonable price, and I think that's about as good as you could ask for when it comes to DLC. So, I would absolutely recommend Lex Imperialis. In fact, I would say this in combination with Void Shadows and the two upcoming DLCs that were recently announced, but obviously we don't have all the details for yet. When you combine all that stuff, Rogue Trader is becoming a really, really good CRPG. It is quickly moving up the list of some of my favorites. I enjoyed it, obviously, when it released, but this has improved dramatically with its first couple of DLCs. And it was already pretty good to start with. But that's pretty much going to do it for today. So I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.